One. Welcome to the Business and Life Stories podcast, hosted by Mike and James. We are the co-founders of Capital Finders, and our mission is helping you learn how to get capital for your startups and early stage companies. Today with us is our special guest, Jason Peters. Jason has an amazing story. When I first met him, it was in the context of listening to some of his sermons and some of his talks, and he's one of these very rare pastors that actually puts his feet on the ground. He's got his head in the clouds and his feet on the ground at the same time. He really connects well with people. And I've been so amazed over the past year or so about how he's able to create real relationships, genuine relationships with all kinds of people, which is so important in our business. And Jason's just taken that out of the business world into the church world, where it really has belonged for a long time. But many churches, as you know, don't do that. So James, I got real excited about interviewing Jason. He's got an amazing story. He didn't start life as, some pastor born with a silver spoon in his mouth and raised in the church his whole life. So go ahead. Everybody welcome Jason.
Thanks, gentlemen. Good to be here. Excited for our conversation today.
All right. So James, you can kick us off with a few questions as you do.
So what did you learn about business from hitting a small ball across the net for thousands of hours, Jason?
Yeah, that's really a fantastic question. So when I got into tennis, it was this immediate transition from I think I want to try to go play on the tour to I start coaching a kid, and because I was in a small town and a big fish in a small pond, so to speak, when I began coaching the town's best junior, I immediately had a business. So I start coaching him, 20 kids follow. And so what do you do? So as I began to get into the coaching world a little bit, the thing that I realized very quickly was that the coaching aspect was very little of really how you're going to be successful. It was just a relationship game. It was, and so I had to get very good at moving in and out of relational pockets, if you will. So if I'm talking to an 8-year-old who's struggling with mom and dad, or I'm talking with mom and dad, or I'm talking with an older coach or a tournament director, it's moving in and out of those pockets and navigating those relationships. And so I think that was, that piece taught me that I could have a successful business even if I wasn't a very good coach, if I invested relationally. I think that would, to answer your question, I think that was the biggest thing, is what I tell people that in the church world, that I mentor, is like the single area of focus needs to be on relationships, real relationships. People want to belong somewhere. Much before, a lot of times now, they believe anything, and they want to know that you care, and they want to know that you're thinking intentionally about them when you're not on the clock. I think that was one of the biggest things that got me a lot of credibility early on, was people began to realize that I actually was thinking about their player, or if it was their kid, when I wasn't on the clock. And man, that goes a long way. I
mean, absolutely. When one watches one of these international tennis matches, we see the skill, and we obviously assume there's tens of thousands of hours of practice. But you're absolutely right. If that player has not got the people around them with the relationships built, then I'm sure that you've come across, and there are numerous stories, aren't there, of players who should have made it but didn't, or made it but then self-imploded, And the percentage as they go up the ladder of so-called success, and maybe they go from a player to a very successful veteran player to a coach and maybe a business or an academy after that. Would you agree that that's all dependent on the relationships, and you can almost see the relationships with that player has built? The number of players get smaller and smaller as that line sort of goes up, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. To give you a couple of examples, so what I specialized, or the level of player I specialized in when I was running this tennis academy, was your high performing athlete. So your junior tennis player. I was focused on junior players, and then kids that went off to university to play would come back. And it was so interesting is all these high performing players, these kids that were top 100 to top 5 in the country, I would see them continue to develop and develop and develop until they went to college. And then they're stagnant, and they come back, and I'm working with them summers and holidays and things like that. And the things I kept hearing was, because I knew these coaches, right? Because I mean, at this point, I knew all the coaches. Because I was coaching at all the major events for U.S. juniors. But the thing I kept hearing is the lack of relational equity between the player and the coach. When I was coaching them, they had a coach that was consistent. If they won, I took them to tournaments. If they lost, I took them to tournaments. We had lessons regardless. They didn't get benched. They didn't get ridiculed. They didn't, and whether that be because that hurt my bottom line, or because I was trying to act consistent with my, religious beliefs, whatever it was. Well, at that time I wasn't even a Christian, so it didn't matter. But they needed consistent relational, they just need a consistent relationship in there. And when you look at the pros, the ones that have done the best, like a Federer, a Djokovic, a Nadal, they've stayed healthy into their 30s. Why? They have the same physio. Novak took off when he got married, and he got a box that he wasn't cussing at, that he was actually looking at for belief. We know Rafa and Uncle Tony, and he's had the same guys around him, and same with Roger. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree with you 100%. I've coached enough players that had the ability to do something special, but did not have the relational dynamics for it to work.
So Jason, how would a business founder, entrepreneur, somebody, which you built your own tennis academy from the ground up, how do you prevent yourself from going stagnant? What are some practices that should be implemented?
Yeah, well, so for me, I was trying to innovate all the time personally. So when I got into coaching, I had good coaching growing up. And what you find in the tennis world is most of the time, a great player or a good player will go in and they'll coach based on what they learned. And if you do that, you're behind. You're already behind, because tennis is just like, other sports, but even more so because there's an equipment variable in there as well. It's constantly innovating. People are constantly doing things a little bit different than they did before. It's easy to see, say a Lindell and a McEnroe and some of the Stefan Edberg, some of the 80s and 90s guys, and their footwork patterns and the way they're swinging and grips they're using and weight of rackets, compared to then you kind of switch to the Agassi Sampras, and they changed things up. Agassi started opening his hips up all the time, to then Federer and Rafa, and then now some of these young guys. So I tried to innovate. So what I did was I looked at the best systems in the world I could get my hands on, from Spain, from Eastern Europe, and then from the States, particularly Bolletary Tennis Academy in Florida. And then I tried to take the best of all of it, of those three, because I couldn't manage more than that, and innovate my own system. So the Spanish Sanchez Casal, that academy was very, very, very successful when I was coaching, and they did things differently in a lot of ways with patterns and footwork and movement than the U.S. players, and they built players different. The U.S. did some things really well, and then Eastern Europeans did things that were different than the other two, and so that always helped me. And then I started adding components. So I was a great coach technically. I could get better. So read outside your skill set. My skill set was not biomechanics, but I went outside and started looking at biomechanics and looking at how to analyze players with video and things like that. And then you just keep doing it. There's always something to learn. I think that's one of the most important lessons probably about a really successful entrepreneur. Is like you've never arrived. When you've arrived, you're behind the game. Yeah, I mean, you're behind, so don't ever arrive. It's actually not a good place to be. Keep innovating. And so then I got into mental. What does it look like to build a player cognitively where they're strong from a cognitive standpoint? What's it look like to keep pushing the envelope of how to train them physically? And then how do you blend systems? How do you how do you incorporate periodization into your athlete? This guy, there's no shortage of things to learn. It's just, I think human nature tells us when you arrive, rest, sit on it. And so I think we had to do the opposite.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that. That's certainly been the experience of James and myself. There's always something new to learn. Reading outside of what we, our little bubble is really important. As one of my investing mentors told me years ago, if you're not skimming and going through at least 150 pages of brand new material a day, I mean, that's the bare minimum just to even stay in this business. So yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. So you now have a church that is well renowned in Austin, Texas, which is, a fairly liberal, far left-wing socialist kind of a city. The vibe going here, and it's pretty much everybody for themselves in this town, coupled with a weird mentality, which we all love, of helping people from outside. So people come here like after the big hurricane in Houston, the one in New Orleans, people would come here and we, our town helps them, but we're not so good at helping people that are already here. But your church is getting really well known for being out there on the street and helping people and sharing the gospel without being, I would say, in your face about it. It's kind of like you share it in the context of what you're doing. So tell us, how the heck did you make that shift? I mean, I assume you could have stayed a super rich tennis coach and franchised this out. So what drove that big change?
The money did get better, but when tennis players are fickle as well. And so I think, not that I'm an expert in business at all, but I think, anytime you're looking to start something, you have to be willing to say goodbye to people and do it with class and do it with grace and honor, because those people may end up coming back around. But even if they don't, they will talk. They will talk. And a good reputation is hard to find these days, but I think it still matters. But one thing with church that I think is vital is that we don't practice this idea of C.S. Lewis called it chronological snobbery, where you can't look back and see how the church was in times of persecution, or where if you're a Christian, you're an outsider, and kind of snub your nose at that, because we can learn so much from the early church that wasn't trying to be in your face. Like the church between, say, 60, 70 AD and before Constantine, they grew immensely in a culture that did not like them, thought they were weird, thought they were atheists because they only worshiped one God, thought that they did really abominable practices for a Greco-Roman culture, but they were attracted to Christianity because their message and their lifestyle matched. And I think whatever you're in, wherever you're, especially if you're leading people, your message and your lifestyle have to match, because I would say it's probably a universal phenomenon that people hate hypocrites. They can't stand them. And not that any of us are going to be perfect or arrive there, but you've got to try to have your message and your life match. So, I think Oak Hill Bible Church does a good job of just being comfortable being Christian. So we're not out to prophetically tell people where they're going to spend eternity, as much as we are a come and see kind of mentality. Like, you interested in Jesus? Well, just come hang out with us, and maybe you could get a glimpse. And along the way, I'll tell you about him, and I'll tell you why I follow him and things like that. But I'm also going to be your neighbor, whether you reject Jesus or accept Jesus. I'm going to love you for who you are. And hopefully my life before you, in all its brokenness and messiness, will be a reflection of Christ, but just a reflection, because we're not pointing. Christianity isn't about pointing people to ourselves. It's about pointing people to someone who we think is worth following. Does that answer your question, Mike?
Yeah, it really does. Also, I want to pause here for a second. We may lose power in a moment. If so, I'll send a new link immediately. So,
sure.
James, did you have another question?
Well, we've only got a minute left. So,
all right. So, Jason, to wrap it up, we put links down below for people that want to reach you, or people maybe in Austin, or even people to email you with questions. What's the number one thing you could tell an entrepreneur, an early stage startup, that you've learned about business, mixing your business and faith and combining those? What's a key takeaway for folks?
Be transparent from the get-go, from the start. No matter how successful you get, admit when you fail, and then bring people along with you. Whatever you're doing, bring people along, because you're only as good as you're only as good as the weakest person.
Man, that's really awesome, Jason. So being transparent, that's really strong advice. And can you tell us a little bit more about how you take people with you?
Yeah, I mean, it's super practical. I think Jesus did it like this. If I'm going to go, say, visit someone in the hospital, I could go by myself, or I could bring somebody along with me. If I'm going to go meet, someone, I met a friend of mine is probably a lot of people would say he's a world leader in cognitive linguistics and analyzing discourse, particularly in the Greek New Testament. And he's a great guy. Well, when he comes to Austin, I could go meet with him and I could glean all of this information, or I could bring people into that conversation, even if they can barely hang, just to get them exposure to the conversation. If I'm going to give counsel or advice to someone, I mean, I think the best way to train people is and let them know you care is to invite them into meaningful situations. It's easy to create practice situations for people, but that doesn't add near as much value as when you bring them into a meaningful situation. And then you just build, again, I'm sure the term's out there, but relational equity is built. And to James and I's conversation before, reciprocity can be a beautiful thing when your whole organization happily functions in that way. When they want to, live in a situation, business speaking or church speaking, where they want to give. And when reciprocity happens, where you're supporting this person, but you're not necessarily looking for that person to support you, you know that another person that you have a relationship with you is supporting you. So you can act in grace without feeling exposed. And that's a beautiful thing to me, is when people can serve each other and and not feel exposed, because at the same time, say I'm serving you, James is serving me, and then that dynamic gets, I think, very healthy. At least in the church world, it's very, very healthy when people are serving each other without looking over their shoulder to wait for the relationship to falter or wait for someone to let someone else down. Yeah, so I think that's huge.
That's excellent. It's really encouraging to hear that's happening in at least one church. It's been the case in business for a long time that the companies that do well and stick around the longest and survive all kinds of disasters are the ones that operate in what James would like to call the pirate ship model, where it's basically everybody on the crew is pulling together and everybody shares in the profits. Now, unlike pirates, we don't steal any money. You know, we're not criminal lawyers here. A joke for all my lawyer friends. But yeah, it's the sharing, right? And you know that everyone's working together, because if someone's not pulling their weight, they kind of get self-identified anyway. So that's really strong stuff, man.
Yeah, I mean, when I look at, say, the New Testament, right, as a pastor theologian, that's what I see. I see Jesus being the master of sharing experiences with people. You know, and the Gospels are very interesting in the way they're written. They're written from a framework, a standpoint of seeing these pictures, these scenes of Jesus sharing experience with people. And whether or not you're a Christian, I think we can learn from that because of how influential Jesus has been just in Western culture, is the power of the meaningful shared experience. Maybe that would be, one thing that I would encourage every entrepreneur, every business leader to think about, is how can you create more meaningful shared experiences with your company, with the people that are looking to you. A lot of times, you have their livelihood in your hands, or and you control, for lack of a better word, a lot of aspects of their life. And so, if they're going to extend that trust to you, then extend the trust back. But you do that with shared experiences. It's why everybody loves the Christmas party if they go to the boss's house, not because of the free food, but because they get to share in the life of that individual. And again, that's why, having meals with people, it's so cliche, but I think it matters, because you're really sharing something that's a necessity for life with someone else. And again, I look to Jesus, who did that so often and with different kinds of people, So yeah, shared experiences are fantastic.
Well, thanks for being with us today, Jason. Do you have any additional questions, James?
Well, I was just going to see if I could sum it up from what I've been hearing, and from maybe as a early stage or startup perspective, because there's a lot really to carry over as Jason has really talked about here. And what we've really talked about is the power of building relationships, being innovative, sort of learning auxiliary skills, or having auxiliary systems, or which becomes supporting systems, although maybe not obvious initially. We've also talked about transparency, and then reciprocity. And for me, I mean, when you think of some of the most successful businesses on the planet, they really tick all those boxes. The best ones do, and I think there's a lot to learn, isn't there, for those 4 or 5 elements to be taken into early stage and as startups, to have a vision of giving rather than expecting to take or be given investing or funds, right?
Definitely. Okay, folks. So we love all of you. Thanks for being here. Jason Peters has just given us some really tremendous practical ideas for how to build relational equity, how to create real relationships, doing that through shared experiences. how to avoid going stagnant. I mean, he's handing you a bag of gold, and I hope you're smart enough to pick it up. All right, until next time, we'll see you guys.
James, Mike, thanks a lot for having me on. Appreciate it.
It's a pleasure.
Our
Thank you
pleasure.
very much.
Absolutely. See you.